The space element is a little bit different from the other elements that we've talked about so far. And part of the reason for that is that space is like the open ground in which all the other elements arise. The elements are earth, water, fire, air, and space. And when they're in balance in our body, energy, and mind, we can live happier, healthier lives. If you'd like more free resources on the elements, please find the link in the info box below to get teachings on all 5 elements organized into an email series. Plus, you'll be notified of future live teachings. This talk was recorded live on Insight Timer and only lightly edited, so you'll hear me respond to questions and comments. Some of what I'm going to say today comes from the teachings of Ann and Harvey at Dawn Mountain. Some, if you've been watching this series, you know where I'm getting this stuff. It's from this book, Healing with Form, Energy, and Light. It's wonderful. It has a lot more material on these elements, especially the more, esoteric aspects of the elements. I highly recommend that book. So the space element, it's about presence. This is something that came up in the retreat at Dawn Mountain over the weekend. It's about presence. I had never really thought of it that way before, but the basic definition of space in the context of Tibetan Buddhism and also, Tibetan logic, Tibetan epistemology, is that space is the absence of obstructive contact. So the fact that I can move my hand like in front of my face means that there's not something blocking my hand. So that's the basic definition of space. It is the holding, the space within which the space within which things happen, things arise, things dissolve, experience happens. So space is kind of unique among the elements in that there's nothing you can exactly point to and say that is space. It's all around us. It's inside us. The hollow, spaces in our digestive system, in our lungs, in our throat. All of that space is what makes it possible for air to flow through our body, for instance, or for food to move through our digestive system. So space is critically important. But here's the thing about space. We don't usually notice space. What we tend to notice is the objects in the space. So for instance, I'm sitting in my little office/shrine room right now. My computer is on the chair in front of me. There is a meditation bench under my bum. Those are objects, and it's very natural for our minds to focus on those objects and forget about the space in between them. Even if you're planning a road trip, and really the whole trip is about crossing the space between where you are and where you want to get to, we're not usually thinking of the space of the road itself. We're usually thinking, what's at the next exit? If you're from Texas and you're a Buc-ee's fan, or whatever the local, highway pit stop is in your place, you might be thinking about that. Where's the next one? What kind of snacks can I get? Are the bathrooms going to be clean? So we're thinking about what's in the space, not necessarily the space itself. And so that just makes space different from the other elements. Even with air, you can't really see air, but if there's a wind blowing leaves, you can see what the air is doing. You can feel the air as it enters your body. But with space, we're actually just learning to pay attention to the spaces between things, or thoughts, or breaths, or people. So there can be emotional space, there can be, psychological space, there can be space in time, there can be space in space. For anyone who's a nerd and watched a lot of Star Trek growing up, or Star Wars, or any of those space exploration shows, well, speaking from myself as such a nerd, space is almost like the expanse in which anything can happen. And I think that's actually a pretty good way of thinking about the space element. So part of what's interesting about the space element, like I said, is this kind of definition that it's the absence of obstructive contact. The other really characteristic thing about space, though, is it's the element in which all the other elements can arise. Anything can arise. And it's also the element into which we all dissolve back again. Every thought, every physical construction. I mean, I'm, looking at an office chair, I'm inside a house. Sooner or later, this house will fall down and collapse, and the space inside the house and the space outside the house will become one space again. Oh my gosh, Logan says Coke made a new flavor called Space Flavor. I think I'm going to be shopping this afternoon because I have to try that. Bring on the sugar and the calories. Logan says literally came out a day ago. Oh my God, that's such good timing. So in terms of space, what it's associated with in our bodies is consciousness. If you're at all familiar with the Tibetan teachings on the death process, you'll already know that basically as we die, at least in the way that the tradition describes it, as we die, our bodies and minds break down with the elements. So like the earth element dissolves and we feel like we don't have the support of our bones and our body anymore. We feel really heavy and just, like we're melting into the bed. So one by one, the different elements dissolve, and the space element related to consciousness is the last one to go. And obviously, the death process is a whole other context, but I just want to underscore that there's this strong connection between consciousness itself, or awareness, or presence, however you want to call it, and the space element. I actually want to talk first about the space element in meditation, because I think it may actually be easier to understand space in terms of meditation practice. In meditation, the space element is the mind itself. Thoughts arise in the mind, experiences happen in the mind, visual or auditory experiences are processed in the mind. So all of that relates to consciousness, but all of those are objects of consciousness. And space is the consciousness itself. I actually have a track on this on Insight Timer. I'll post it in the notes for the recorded version of this. But basically, when you start noticing the space in your mind, it's like you start training your mind to recognize that we're not just what arises in the mind, that there's something in which all of this is arising. So if you're doing mindfulness of thoughts, for instance, and a thought arises, it's natural for us to pay more attention to the thought than the space in which the thought arises. Learning about the space element is like an invitation to also notice the space in which the thought arises. The space between thoughts. If you're paying attention to your breath and you've exhaled all the way, there's a tiny little space between the end of the out breath and the beginning of the in breath. And sometimes if I do a guided meditation on the breath, I'll actually emphasize that space between, because I think it starts to sensitize us to the things we can't see, like to consciousness itself, to experience itself, to not just the objects of experience or consciousness, but that wide field in which all experience happens. So in meditation, when we have a balanced space element, we can rest in that spaciousness, and if something comes up in the mind as we're meditating, we can notice it without getting sucked into it completely. That's what happens when a thought comes up and then we end up following the thought. There's no problem with a thought coming up. It's you may have heard this saying before, it's like a bird flying through space. The thought leaves no track, no chemtrail or contrail or whatever they're called behind airplanes. The bird doesn't leave anything like that. The thought flying through your mind is like that bird. There's nothing left after it. So if we can hold the sense of spaciousness and that ability for an experience to arise and the ability for the experience to dissolve again, we're cultivating a connection with awareness itself. if we don't have enough space element in meditation, then we just end up getting sucked into every thought that comes up or every experience that comes up. And I think for a lot of us, honestly, this is just the first part of learning to meditate. Learning that there's going to be tons of thoughts that come up, tons of experiences that draw our attention into them. And I don't know that it would be helpful. Logan says, don't grab the bird, just let it fly away. Exactly. I don't know that it would be helpful to try and explain space to folks who are just beginning a meditation practice. But I think, well, the folks I know who are online right now, none of y'all is like a beginner. So I hope this can maybe add an extra layer to your meditation practice, even if it's a really basic breath meditation or a loving kindness meditation. Any of that is arising within the space of the heart or of the mind. I told myself I wasn't going to talk about this, but I just have to say, the space element is connected with emptiness. And emptiness is too big a topic to address right now, but for those of y'all who know what it means and who know the context, basically, I'll just summarize very quickly for everyone else. Emptiness means that what we see and what we experience isn't inherently existent. Like, for instance, if I take this mug that has my tea in it, I look at it and I just see a mug. I mean, because that's how our brains work. Like, we've evolved to be able to just process things very quickly. But the emptiness of inherent existence of the mug means if I were to take this mug and like hit it with a hammer and shatter it into like 1,000 pieces, would it still be a mug? And then if I were to throw 999 of the pieces in the trash, would it still be a mug? And if I were to grind up that last remaining piece into tiny bits of powder, is it still a mug? Like, if there was ever an inherently existent mug here in the first place, it would have to always be a mug. This may or may not make any sense. I may have been wrong to even bring it up, but like, I just love emptiness so much. I wrote my dissertation on it. I'm a little bit obsessed. So anyway, the connection between emptiness and the space element is that everything can arise in space. Like, because it is literally the absence of obstructive contact, it is a field in which everything can arise. But what that means is nothing is ever stuck. Because anything can arise in space, anything can dissolve away or change into something else. It's like space is the luminous womb of reality. Emptiness is the luminous womb of reality. It might be hollow, but it's not empty. It's a space that creates, or in which things can arise. You know, the space itself isn't necessarily creating my next thought. But if there wasn't the space of the mind, my next thought couldn't happen. So anyway, space is an incredibly profound element. There's a lot of really, really profound teachings on it. Most of them require too much of an explanation to talk about now, but if you're into emptiness, just let me know and I'll talk about it in the future because I love talking about emptiness. So that's the space element in meditation and kind of in Buddhist philosophy. What does the space element look like in our lives? And this is where I think Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche's description in Healing with Form, Energy, and Light is really helpful. So I'll just read these descriptions. I'm just also going to say space is not my forte. I feel like rushing around focusing on the objects in the space is definitely more where I focus. I think honestly that's pretty common, but just listen to the description of someone with a balanced space element in their life. This is on page 19, and I'm going to read a bit from page 20 also. When the space element is balanced in us, there is room in life. Whatever arises can be accommodated. There is enough time, enough emotional capacity, enough tolerance. The elements of experience all fit. They are neither too much nor too little. We are not dissociated from experience nor completely caught by it. Rather than running after or away from the content of experience, we are more rooted in ourselves or the one who is experiencing. I just want to read that last sentence again because it's so amazing to even think about living this way. rather than running after or away from the content of experience. We are more rooted in ourselves, or the one who is experiencing. So that's a balanced space element, when there's enough space but not too much. When there's too much space, we might actually have difficulty connecting with experience itself. We're just kind of like floating through life, and you might have a job, but it doesn't seem that important, or you might have a partner, but you don't feel that connected. Just nothing really seems to make contact. And with too little space, and this is where I feel I personally have more experience, with too little space, you can't fit everything into your life. You're too focused, I'm too focused on the contents of life to notice the balance with the big picture. I'll just read again the description of too little space. Too little space leaves us dominated by whatever arises. Everything seems solid and impenetrable. Small problems can be overwhelming, big problems devastating. Too little space makes it easier for another element to dominate and determine our reactions. So this kind of leads to another special characteristic of space, which is that with the other elements, obviously, they're all interconnected. So when you cultivate one element and you get it balanced, it's going to affect the way that all the other elements show up in life too. But with a space element, my sense of things is that it's more of an outcome of balancing the other elements to have balanced space in your life. Like, you can't just decide, I'm going to go cultivate a lot of space in my life today. Space just is. It's just what happens. I do think it's helpful to do meditations on space. Not just space in meditation, but also to notice the space around you, like physically, the space in the room. To take a moment, if you're, for instance, walking through the forest, and just feel the space between yourself and the trees. There's something really beautiful about like a space that's defined but open, like a cathedral, or a path you're walking down where there are trees on either side, but there's like an open space in the middle. So the more you're able to notice those things, I think the more it actually helps to wake up from that trance of the objects of consciousness, or the objects going through our mind, and to kind of get centered again in ourselves, in that core of our being. And the core of our being is luminous, and it is spacious, and it is intimately connected with these qualities of the space element. I mentioned emptiness earlier. I'll just throw out another big giant term, Buddha nature. Like, according to Mahayana Buddhism, Buddha nature is the true, like, inherent, you could say, self of each of us, but it's a type of self that is not like what we think of as our ordinary self. You know, there's no form, there's no beginning, no end. It's a timeless aspect of reality rather than like an identity that you could put like a name tag on and say, oh, that's me. I recognize myself there. So Buddha nature is luminous. It's spacious. If we're able to feel into that and to trust into that, then we have the capacity to just let what needs to flow. And I haven't read this in a book anywhere, but I feel like that's also really connected with that space element, you know, just getting out of the way of the natural flow of reality. And I just want to talk about how to try and cultivate that sense of space in daily life. So obviously, there's doing meditations on space, and I think that's really helpful for supporting like daily life kind of practices. But I think it is also helpful to intentionally look out for space, to take a break. I've mentioned in the last talk that I did last week about how to structure your meditation practice. I like to take short breaks during the day, and sometimes I like to do a little meditation there. And often, you know, I think when we take that kind of break, like my focus has been sort of collapsed down onto my computer screen usually, or like whatever I'm focusing on. And just coming out of that and like taking 3 deep breaths, doing a little stretching, whether it's in my chair or standing up, doing a little qigong, if you can notice the way that your attention opens back up again, from having been collapsed into that object to like becoming present again, it feels so good. And it's something that happens, you know, every time you take a break at work. Honestly, every time you have one of those moments, like you're interacting with a little kid, or you're at the beach, or you're watching a sunset, and you just feel like, oh, wow, this is like what life is about. Just see if you can notice the space in that. Like, so many of our peak moments are not about, I don't know, accomplishment or the objects of our awareness so much as just that sense of effortless flow and ease, which I think is related to the space element. So Sil asked, so space connects everyone and everything? Yes, exactly. Like, well, first of all, you know, the way that space works in modern physics is kind of a good analog for the way that space works in the Tibetan system of talking about the elements. You know, what Einstein said, basically, like his insight is that the way gravity works is not that, you know, the Earth over here and like Mars over there act directly on each other. The Earth actually, like any object with a lot of mass, warps the space around it. And that warping at a subtle level impacts all the rest of space. And that's exactly the same thing that the space element does. Like, it's the space in which things happen. And I mean, the space element itself doesn't get like contracted or expanded or anything like that. You can't have like a black hole that kind of punches a hole in the fabric of space. But to the extent that we're all connected by space, we're all interacting in this one kind of vast field across which physics works, I think that is analogous to the space element. It's also a little bit like the Force in Star Wars. I keep making a lot of like nerd references today. I don't know why. But anyway, you know, the Force connects everyone together. And when a Jedi allows the Force to flow through them, they're like in tune with the Force itself. It's the source of their powers. So yes, like the space element is like that. And if you think about your own experience, you know, space is like the arena in which all of it unfolds. It's like 2 thoughts, you know, they overlap in that space, or like one dissolves away and the next one picks up. So, you know, over the weekend, in this retreat that I did with my teachers at Dawn Mountain, they talked about space as being like presence, you know, that when you show up and you're present for something, there's a kind of, like, you're showing up in space, you know? And if you're just collapsed onto an object, you're not really present to the situation, to the scene. So it's like a long, possibly not very direct answer to your question, Sil, but I hope that at least sparks some things for you to reflect on the space element more and see what it's like in your own experience. Deanna says, how can we use silence to be aware of space? She says, make use of silence in a meeting, a gathering, and not mistake it as nothing is happening. Yes. So important. This is probably true of all cultures, but I know right now in the modern West, or just the modern world, where we have, you know, phones and computers, and there's just almost an infinite number of things drawing our attention in. It can feel like a moment of silence, or just a moment where we're not doing anything, is a moment when there could be something happening, but there's not, like a wasted moment. And just like Deanna is saying, if we can actually like reclaim those moments, like not fall into just another object of consciousness, trying to check something off the to-do list, or, you know, check the news on your phone or something. If you can actually take those moments and just open out to spaciousness, it's a really profound practice. Deanna says, we are uncomfortable with silence. Turn on the radio, Google something. Yes. For me personally, I know that I am getting into maybe like an overworked or a stressed emotional state when I listen to podcasts, like anytime there would be silence. If I'm just popping earbuds in my ears all day long, that's a bad sign. Because for me, if there's something uncomfortable that I don't want to face, you can tune that out by just making something arise in space and then latching onto it instead of allowing, whatever's already going on to kind of show itself. Dave says, gravity, one of the 5 fundamental forces. Yeah, exactly. In a way, I mean, the fundamental forces of physics, it's like descriptions of how matter and energy work. And it's not really that different from, Tibetan descriptions of how a different type of energy, but still I think something really important and fundamental to the world works. Keith says, the force. I was thinking about that too. I'm glad it wasn't just me. Still says, yes, thank you. Totally made me think of the force. Okay. Y'all are my people. I'm glad that Star Wars is a language we can all share. Debbie says, love the 11th verse of Tao. Shape clay into a vessel. It is the space within it that makes it useful. Yes, exactly. Exactly. We tend to think of like the vessel itself as being the thing that performs the function of, holding water. To come back to the example of my cup. I mean, obviously, without the shape of the cup, the water couldn't be held. But if there were no emptiness inside the cup, no empty space in here, it also wouldn't hold any water. It'd be full of something else. Yeah, so the emptiness within is a really critical part of, a cup functioning, a water bottle functioning, anything that involves space. This also makes me think of a famous Zen story where this very learned scholar goes to a Zen master, and the master starts pouring tea for them, and the scholar is just asking question after question after question, not really hearing the answers. And the Zen master has been pouring the tea, and he just keeps pouring, and it's just flowing over this cup. And finally the scholar says, what are you doing? And the Zen master says, well, what are you doing? Your cup is already full. You're not here to receive any new instructions or wisdom. You already think you know everything. So I think that emptiness of the willingness to receive new perspectives, new ideas, new visions of ourselves and others and the world around us, all of that is super, super important. Syl says, great comment, Debbie. Thanks. Yeah. Taoism has a lot of wonderful wisdom, especially on the topic of, emptiness, space, hollowness like that. Logan says, beginner's mind. Ah, yes, so good. Debbie says, Tao continues, the usefulness of what is depends on what is not. To put it in Buddhist terms, I think that's the relationship between, you could say form and emptiness. Everything, I think this is something people often misunderstand, the idea of emptiness. It's not just that nothing is there or nothing exists. It's that there is a space in which anything can exist because nothing is static. Everything is constantly in a state of flow. And that too is related to the space element. The things can arise in space, dissolve into space. The space itself is not transformed or even affected in any way. Glenn says, or is the absence of surface at the top that opens up to the emptiness beneath to allow it to be a cup? Well, yeah, I mean, if you covered it, you'd have no access to the space inside it. I think if you apply the idea of the cup to meditation practice, for instance, we need some kind of structure for a practice. Maybe what I'm doing is focusing on the breath, focusing on a mantra, focusing on, whatever your object of meditation may be. So you need some form. But then within that, there come moments when your mind is able to just flow fully with the object of your meditation, and you can let go of that form. It's more the emptiness that's important in those moments of just no longer needing a me and an object of meditation that's somehow subtly separate from the observer. The observer can dissolve, the object can dissolve, and there's just the experience of observing. I don't know if that's getting a little too too philosophical or off topic from like a simple cup. Dave says, funny thing, the older I get, seems the less I know. Yeah, that might not be a bad thing though. Keith says, me too, Dave. The more I study, the less I know for sure. Dave says, non-dual reference. Yes, totally. Probably even as you typed that, I was kind of getting to the non-duality part. Yeah, ultimately, even with space, there's not a duality between space and the things in the space. Like there's the space itself, like where my head is, obviously my hand can't move through it because there's obstruction. Space is the absence of obstructive contact. But my head exists within that space. I mean, I can move it where I want to move it because there's space. Yeah, I feel like the space element is one where the best way of experiencing the space element is to experiment in your own practice and your own daily life and just see what happens. You know, when we're talking about the space element, it's more of a fruitional experience. Like maybe you're meditating and you just have a tiny moment where there's not a sense of subject and object anymore. There's just noticing. You can't decide to do this. So that's why I think it's important to notice when it naturally happens, because you can't really make it happen. For those listening later, I'll put a link to the space meditation on Insight Timer in the info box. But yeah, I think with space more than with the other elements, the more you start to notice it and to fold in that like noticing practice to daily life, the more likely you are to have not to have them, but to notice the moments of natural non-duality or just a natural luminous emptiness. And it doesn't have to be fancy or special. Like, you know, it's just natural human experiences that you have, but can you recognize them? Dave says, luminous emptiness, profound. Totally is. That's like a lifetime. Like those two words together, you know, for me, they're like a pith instruction, like just a little phrase that you could spend your entire practice life contemplating, and it would just keep opening up deeper and deeper and deeper for you. So if that resonates with you, Dave, that is awesome. And it's definitely something to explore and practice. Yeah. Oh, I also wanted to say, I have set up a little mailing list for the 5 elements. So that if you're interested and you want to get notified, like if I do something else live in the future, or, you know, I'm planning to put together all these teachings into at least a full blog post. Maybe I'll make some other resources to go with them because I found them really helpful. Like the 5 elements, not like my teachings necessarily. Well, thank you so much. I hope that the elements can help you notice your own experience and maybe cultivate your own practice in a way that's helpful, maybe even transformative. I feel like it's been really helpful for me to spend time with these practices. Thanks for listening to this teaching on the elements. Please take a moment to sign up for the free email course to get the teachings from this series, invitations to live events, and more.